For early access to more videos like this, plus exclusive content, community discussions, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/Bruce Poinsette. What's going on, world? Welcome to the Bruce Poinsette podcast, formerly The Mission. But what was the mission, you ask? Liberation, always and forever. But nonetheless, this is now the Bruce Poinsette podcast for the sake of just a little bit more originality. But the format stays the same. We come on, I share a little video essay with you, or audio essay if you're listening. And then we've added a interview portion, which I will get to shortly. But I want to talk about the theme of today's episode, which is fully human. So with that in mind, we have some questions. So how do we push and struggle for liberation while nourishing our full selves? How do we make not just the fight, but our lives sustainable? Many of us are struggling, so our people and future generations especially don't have to deal with things or deal with the things we're already dealing with. So we're struggling out here so we can thrive. But how do we start making that ability to thrive a reality? Or at the very least, modeling what that looks like, all while we're in the midst of this struggle? How do we start tapping into something bigger than the anger and uncertainty and insecurity of this moment while not losing our sense of purpose? I believe the answer is in adopting approaches that serve our full humanity, or to be fully human, if you will. A couple things inspired this thought. First was just the end of 2020, and to be quite honest with you, my body and my mind just crashing. And the second was the white supremacist riots, siege, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, at the US Capitol on January 6th. So first, let's go the first one, which was the end of 2020. And keeping in line with that idea of the mission, it was a very mission-centered year. Obviously, there was the election. There was, so many of us trying to seize on the momentum of the protests to keep this energy going and to keep this activism going and get growing stronger. But we're all also doing this during a global pandemic. So just the fact that a lot of us literally or a lot of us figuratively and some literally were spending that entire year and much of the time before that just in a survival mode, pure survival mode. So like many, I didn't spend enough time investing in my longevity. My work-life balance was out the window. My processed food and, delivery tab, go Grubhub, go Uber Eats, that through the roof. Whatever consistency I used to have in a cardio routine, that was gone. Even small stuff like, reading comic books, watching goofy TV shows, as part of some volunteer program, reading with kids, which obviously we couldn't do because a pandemic. These little things that just feed your imagination and bring you a little bit of joy and take you out of just all the chaos going on. I didn't indulge in those things like I would in past years. I didn't do much of those things. And you're so caught up in everything that's happening that didn't really hit me until really just around the turn of the year. And I'll tell you, if you remember the Oregon Kwanzaa Stories series, by the time I posted the last one, my mind and my body crashed. I remember just that weekend just being, holed up in my bed, just having you know, these old man pains just shooting through my body in ways that's like I couldn't even explain. And ultimately it was just my body telling me, you can't do this anymore. This isn't going to work. So that was my body telling me I need to switch up my approach. But then, the insurrection happened. And, obviously it, brought up a lot of thoughts in a lot of people, you know, It definitely was not great for, the anxiety or anything like that. But I think, what a lot of people saw was these white supremacists who've been telling us this entire time they want a second civil war. They were trying to make good on their word. I mean, just a quick aside, depending on how you look at it, the first Civil War either never ended or possibly, I would say, actually began in 2008 when you saw the Tea Party rise in response to, the election of Barack Obama. But again, that's a discussion for another time. So besides the violence, the entitlement, and the very clear conflict of interest within the Capitol Police, or as many might look at it, same reason you don't see Bruce Wayne and Batman in the same room. What we also witnessed, or at least what I witnessed with the insurrection, was the volatility of our opponents. Just how unsustainable a lot of what they're doing is. Like how is it unsustainable? They've been waving those Confederate flags since the Civil War. They've got, all this talk media infrastructure, these politicians, obviously the police, military, et cetera, on their side. But you look at again, just the chaos and the lack of unity, even unified under this idea of, trying to maintain the Trump presidency, trying to, they won't say fighting for white supremacy, but to be real, fighting for white supremacy. But you look at how they treat each other. One of theirs was shot in the neck and she died. Do they care? Do they care? No. You had, was it 3 other people on the scene who they died of medical emergencies, or they trampled over one, I guess. Another person may have tased himself. Yeah, fact check that. I'd like to sit here and say I cared so much, but I'm sorry. But again, all these things happened, and if you're keeping track right now, that's 4. If you remember, 4 people died in Benghazi, and we had how many hearings? Just saying. But no. That's not even the end of it. Many of these same people were the same people talking about the thin blue line and blue lives matter. And yet these people literally beat a cop to death with a fire extinguisher. Like they bludgeoned a man to death with a fire extinguisher. Something that's what you see in a horror movie. They did that, and again, crickets. There's the only thing tying this all together is that, their own insecurities, their anxieties, white resentment, and they'll destroy each other. You watch the GOP right now and the supposed fracture. I don't believe it, but we'll see. But you look at, even amongst the news, Fox is hurting in its ratings in a way it hasn't before. You're seeing these threats from more extreme people or more extreme media outlets. All that tells me is that, yeah, these people have been able to go pretty far, again, riding the wave of white resentment, but they're not loyal to each other. They're not, they're not going to war for each other. They're still fighting for greed. And, anyone can get it as soon as it, makes sense to not everyone, just somebody. So when your enemy is such a self-destructive force, how do you combat that? It can't just be by being like them, obviously. So, this is I'm recording this right now on January 20th. The 18th was Martin Luther King Day, so this is going to feel especially appropriate. But for me, the answer, as cheesy as it sounds, how do we combat this? With love, not, kumbaya love, but the love that creates trust and a real commitment to defend each other. The love that compels us to nourish not just resistance, but joy, community, and literal hunger because, again, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of an economic crisis. People are hurting. People are starving. People don't have shelter. We're looking for love that inspires us to not just abolish these systems of oppression and greed, but create new realities that serve all our needs and transform society. How do we do that? Well, how do we take care of the full human when we do this work? One template I've found has been houses of worship. You know, I'm a devout agnostic, but I grew up in a church and I still stay connected with it, with the people there. I mean, it maybe kind of helps that, you know, I grew up in Ainsworth UCC, which was on, at one point was labeled by, I forget the publication or site or whatever it was called, but they labeled it a terrorist church. So, you know, always, always got love for Ainsworth. But, you know, what I found in there is, yes, you know, there's the service and the Bible study, but you have so much more. You have this, it's a real community. You've got, you know, some people come for the music. We all, you know, we all join in food and fellowship. Obviously, you got the youth groups, you got, you know, these special events, whether it's these social gatherings or in the case of, you know, Ainsworth, you had so many people who, admittedly, I took this for granted growing up, was just the people who were involved in all the, you know, not just the parades, but the marches, you know, acts of civil disobedience. But even then, beyond like the official events, you know, it's people helping people find housing, helping people find jobs. You've got these, you know, this justice oriented work happening for people who are not even part of the church. You know, at Ainsworth, they have the HIV/AIDS Center, but then you have other churches throughout Portland who, you know, they double as food kitchens. They provide housing for the houseless. Like, it's about really serving people's needs beyond just, you know, sharing in this book you read. So to that end, today I'm interviewing, you know, longtime partner, I guess now you'd say that, in many different discussion events and activities, Molli Mitchell, who, you know, I got to know through, again, a church collaboration with Bridgeport UCC. But Molli is a student in Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, where she's pursuing her MD or MDiv on a path toward ordination in the United Church of Christ. She previously spent over a decade in Portland, Oregon, where professional and personal experiences led her to her current research interests: the deep questions of what institutional repentance looks like in practice and how to facilitate those processes with accountability and solid spiritual grounding. Molli holds a BS in Human Development and Family Studies and an MSSW, both from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Molli is a recent cancer survivor and lives in New Haven with her cat Noodle. We've got a great conversation about the church and how we use these church spaces and the templates of houses of worship to serve the needs of greater society. I think you'll enjoy it. Check it out. Great. Thank you for, you know, coming on the podcast today. Well, first off, you know, we've had a very historical moment. We're in the midst of a historical moment today. For those who don't know, or for those who'll be watching this later, the House is currently voting on impeachment after, you know, the siege of the Capitol last week. So I think just, again, something that hasn't happened in what, 200 something plus years. I just want to start this off by asking you, you know, how are you processing it all?
Thanks. Yeah. I think it has stoked a lot of sort of like anxieties and fears that I've had for years, probably since Trump was initially elected. It feels like a lot of the things that we were scared about happening, during that like initial election, are really coming to pass. And it's been 4 long years of sort of that anticipation and waiting. And now that it's coming to a head, it feels both, completely inevitable. Like we knew this was going to happen, and also still very unorganized. Like there doesn't seem to be anyone leading the charge. There doesn't seem to be anybody who's, really intentionally trying to take over our government with a coup. Trump just likes to see himself at all times. And so he doesn't seem to have sort of a wider vision for claiming power. It just feels unfair to him. So that's what he's going to do, and lead thousands of people in an insurrection. So yeah, I guess I am worried, particularly for people of color, particularly for queer folks who, will be targeted, who will be, who we've seen in our House of Representatives were targeted by these folks as they continue to wreak violence everywhere they go. So I'm worried about safety. I'm worried about our national infrastructure, and hoping to find strength in organizing and mutual aid.
Yeah, the topic of today's episode is fully human, and when you talk about the lack of organization, that's something I've been thinking about just in the aftermath of this. Was it 5 people? Although there was also another Capitol police officer who committed suicide over the weekend. But, 5 people died at the siege, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. And I just think even those details, when you look at, I guess, for lack of better terms, the opposition, and you think, okay, one person literally was died because they stampeded over her. Another person tased himself. Another person was, a military veteran who, was shot by Capitol Police. And then, they literally bludgeoned the Capitol Police officer to death with a fire extinguisher. Like, when you think back on all just like the lack of caring for their own is, scary. The fact that many of these people and many of the people who were supporting them, it wasn't that long ago where they were heavily pushing this idea of the thin blue line or Blue Lives Matter, all these things. And now, again, they bludgeoned a police officer to death with a fire extinguisher. Like that's something that you see in like a Saw movie, and it hasn't stopped. They've just continued on. People are pressing on. Offline, we were talking about just people, Congress members just openly still lying about the election, about what happened. It's, you realize you're going up against this thing that's, it almost gets overused to talk about being fueled by hate and anger, but I think there is something to be said about the limitations. Like it's a scary force when you realize that disregard for their own lives and these in the name of just white supremacist ideology. But it also kind of tells you, like, I guess the limitations of what they're trying to do, because it is so disorganized. It is so fueled by like these very singular, emotions of anger, of insecurity. So when I look at it for, the rest of us and say, how do we build something to oppose that? How do we stand up against, you know, if you've got something where it's not just random people, but you've got police officers, military veterans, you know, politicians who are very much complicit and shamelessly complicit with it at this point. You know, how do you fight against that? And how do you, you know, I see, because we're all trying to figure it out. But I guess if there's one thing that's kind of come to my mind is just that, you know, again, going back to this idea of fully human approaches and of, you know, we can't just be going up against, I think a lot of us, you know, in like our recruiting and whatnot, you know, we try and tap into anger. We try and tap into, you know, the struggles people are dealing with. But, you know, there's even a lot of like tapping into shame to get people out there. It's true. But if we're not serving something where, you know, we're going into it with that, like for lack of better terms, with that love of each other, like actually caring about each other, do we even stand a chance? Like, it's a very grim place to start this off. But really, like, if we're not, you know, we're going against people who don't care about themselves, we damn sure better be able to care about each other. But yeah, that kind of brings us to like the topic of, you know, this discussion in terms of the church and religious institutions. And, you know, I think a very helpful template that they've set as far as like being able to organize. And to that end, you know, we've had conversations, we've, you know, done podcasts, we've done interview discussions or whatnot. So, you know, it's nothing new for us, but I think in this specifically, like to really like tap in, you know, we talked about, you know, this idea of the nuns and the church connecting with the people who, you know, they write none on their religious affiliation. It's the agnostics, the atheists, the people just aren't part of organized religion, but, you know, we all live in this world together. But before we do that, I think it'd be good to have you, well, one, to have me stop pontificating and filibustering here, but also if you could kind of just, you know, introduce yourself for the audience and kind of talk about your background, both in the church and in social justice work.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Molli Mitchell. I have a master's degree in social work, and I'm working on a second master's of divinity. I'm currently a full-time student at Yale Divinity School. And I most recently, before I moved to New Haven, I most recently lived in Portland for a little over 10 years, a little over 11 years, where I worked in nonprofits, mostly within the domestic violence community, but also was a house manager for the Ronald McDonald House near Legacy Emmanuel for a couple of years, and then was a program director at a tiny little nonprofit that no longer exists, sadly, called Marathon Scholars. And it was a scholarship mentorship program for first-gen college-bound students, working predominantly with, students coming out of kind of intergenerational poverty and wanting access to things that folks with wealth have always had access to. So providing opportunities and open doors was some of my professional work. My church work, though, my church heritage, I would say, is pretty pluralistic. My family on both sides has folks in every denomination that you can probably think of, and folks who have walked away from church. My family, my immediate family, wanted to start out in sort of a Protestant, non-denominational type of church, and found out really quickly that that was not a safe space, not an inclusive space for my sister who has disabilities. The church essentially told them that there was no place for her there.
Wow.
So my family walked out and never walked back into a church. And I grew up sort of with a very natural spiritual reality around me. We went on a lot of hikes. We spent a lot of time out in nature. but we definitely didn't go to church unless Grandma made us go on Christmas and Easter to her Catholic Mass.
So wait, how long was that?
So my sister was born 2 years after I was, and so yeah, they probably left the church when I was 3-ish. So yeah, growing up, I didn't really attend a church at all. I did get invited to certain Christian events because most of my friends were evangelical Christians who were very worried for my soul. So I grew up with a little bit of biblical literacy thanks to them, and had just had a lot of questions. Saw ways in which the church was doing really beautiful things, saw some potential within biblical literature for understanding the things that were going on around me using all sorts of, rhetorical gifts like psalms, prayer, lamentation, kind of talking about the human condition in ways that's, universal, morals and values that resonated with things that I cared about. So yeah, it really sparked a lot of curiosity for me. And I spent college really trying to figure out what's a denomination and why would you care and what does it mean, like what type of church, where would I fit? And it took me about 4 years to really find a church that felt good to go to. So when you talk about the nuns and people who don't feel like they fit in a church, that really resonates. I feel like I was there for a long time. And my immediate family members are still there. There doesn't seem to be a church in which they fit.
Yeah, that path is really interesting. I think my mom kind of took a similar place where, granted, she was on the East Coast and, different time where, she was going to church through probably like high school and whatnot. But then when she was able to get out on her own, she, left, and then, something kind of like brought her back and, met my father, came to Oregon, got involved with the UCC, and, she's super evolved. But it's always interesting just to hear people's, again, just like the story, because I know I grew up in Ainsworth UCC, proudly labeled a terrorist church at one point. So go Ainsworth, even though I'm, very much agnostic. I'm, maybe I'll go like Christmas service and things sometimes now, but, I still have a lot of respect for, the work people are doing. Not a lot, all the people there and all that. But, it's just like these winding paths, but into the church, out of the church, again, the nuns interacting with the Christians. It sounds weird to say out loud in a sentence.
People of faith, maybe, I don't know.
People of faith,
Yeah.
But I think one of the things I've noticed, at least especially as I've tried to get more involved in organizing spaces, is really I've kind of developed a much deeper appreciation for a lot of the things the church does just to serve, again, this idea of the full human. Like, it's not just, it's not just going to Bible study. It's not just going to service on Sunday. I look at, like, it's been interesting just to watch some of these people that, I went to Sunday school with back in the day, and I'm, reading and watching headlines about them just, making like a real imprint on the city of Portland, on the state of Oregon, and just like, oh, I get it now. Like, well, I mean, I kind of got it before, but just like really seeing not just, the short-term work, but just like the long-term work of like really building people. What does it mean when you're, not just serving, studying the religion, but also literally feeding people. A lot of churches right now are providing housing for the houseless. At Ainsworth, they have the HIV/AIDS center, different, different spaces are taking on kind of like different things of serving people, both who are part of them, part of the congregation, also have no interest in being part of the congregation, but, still they're part of the community. So it's kind of been like, it's really been a beautiful thing. And obviously with like, the fact that Respond to Racism before the pandemic was meeting in a church, like that, LOUCC is a huge part of, what we're able to do. So to that end, I kind of just want to talk a little bit about, I had a conversation with your, I guess, former pastor, Tara Wilkins, shout out to Bridgeport UCC, some years ago, because she was the one who brought the idea of the nuns to my attention, and like how we can, just better serve that population, but also, also this idea that a lot of churches right now, like membership, just aging out. Some people are worried about just like these spaces in themselves being, what are we going to do to make sure these spaces are used, or make sure, are these spaces still necessary? What is the call? So yeah, I kind of want to actually, again, I'm going to try not to filibuster as much, but I'm not sure if you watched this or watched the show Black Jesus that used to be on Adult Swim.
No.
Yeah, it was a goofy show. This comedian Slink Johnson basically like he goes through Compton with this ridiculous white Jesus wig and the old things, but it's like modern days. So, and kind of the joke of it is like, yeah, this is exactly what, how this person stands out and is weird in this instance. This is exactly what Jesus would look like if you actually put it in the context of the time. But one of the things one of the episodes, he just decides we need to feed the community. So he starts a taco truck, and it's basically he's basically bringing the ministry out through the neighborhood through this taco truck, as opposed to, requiring people to come to a building and pay tithes and all that. And I was like, oh, that's kind of deep. Like, so yeah, with that,
Yeah.
how do I put this into a question? I guess I would say, can you just talk about, just some of the like stuff you've been involved in, at least with the church, as far as like kind of serving the larger community, or what like efforts you've seen, both, whether it's, locally when you were in Portland, but even, nationally. I know we talk about the Poor People's Campaign a lot, but yeah, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing that churches have always done pretty well is charity. There's always ways that folks have given to ensure that, per scripture, the least of these have been somewhat taken care of. I think one of the reasons that, folks have fallen away from the church is that the church has shirked accountability for all sorts of egregious things over the years, and that doesn't feel right. Like, it doesn't feel like the church, however you want to define that, the church is in right relationship with its community. It doesn't feel like the church is in right relationship with survivors of sexual abuse that were perhaps perpetrated in those walls, or all sorts of reasons, I guess. And so I really understand that kind of wanting to put distance, wanting to see some accountability taken before moving right back into the church, or getting involved, wanting to see public forgiveness offered, or public acts of service, more than being forced to go inside the building to care or to engage. So yeah, I guess I'll start. I have a couple things I guess I want to say. I guess I'll start with things that I've been involved in over time, mostly in Portland, because I think that's most of your audience. So While there, yeah, shout out to Tara, who is still currently my pastor. I'm still technically a member, even though I live out here. Thanks to Zoom, I get to be there all the time. Yeah, I think Bridgeport has done a pretty phenomenal job of taking charity to the next level, and really examining the difference between charity and justice. That charity is somewhat of an easy task. It's giving, it's sometimes service, but it doesn't necessarily address the root causes of what is going on and why. Why do we have so many houseless people in Portland? Why is there so much gender-based violence? What is at the root of those things? And so I think based on not just sort of the pulpit, what the message that's there, but what's happening in committee meetings, the leadership structure of churches, the ways that lay leaders are really empowered to go out and serve. I think that Bridgeport often does a good job of digging up the roots of things like xenophobia in our theology. Sometimes those are really difficult conversations to have. Sometimes those are easy conversations to have, that this is an obvious thing that we can all get behind. But we are willing to dig up the roots in not just our Sunday services. That is one location that ends up happening, but also in our like budget meetings, and also in our, worship team meetings. We're very critical and thoughtful about what we are portraying and why, and how that might be contributing to something like xenophobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. There's a lot of ways that Christian worship is not aware of how anti-Semitic or supersessionist that it is. And I think because Bridgeport is co-located with Shir Tikva, and we have a working relationship with that small Jewish shul here on the east side, the only one on the east side of Portland, that we get to sort of examine what's going on with that. We very purposefully don't put up a ton of Christmas decorations. We very purposefully leave the canvas of our worship space blank when we're in person, because a lot of those things can be really triggering. So anyways, I say all that to say, the justice work that I have been involved in at Bridgeport has included partnerships with Emerge, the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, which provides sanctuary for undocumented folks that are at risk of being deported. We have done all sorts of kind of political actions sitting in the sheriff's office in light of, it's not called sanctuary cities. There was like a thing where we were going to be maybe a sanctuary city, and the sheriff was opposed to that, and we decided to make our voices heard and known. We do a lot of political mail-in cards and actions and things that speak from our place of faith, that reaches out to our elected leaders, to our city and county government officials, and affects national change as well. We also try to get in with, not just get in, but like understand what's happening on the ground, right? So when Portland Street Response was first sort of getting proposed, one of the things that I think our church does well is just to like ask good questions. Why is this an issue that we should care about? What's going on that Portland Street Response is a good alternative?
And just for listeners, real quick, this Portland Street Response is, I think they just get deployed today. But yeah, they're an alternative to having police officers responding to, issues on, is it specifically houseless people, or is it just street?
Yeah, I think it's for a lot of different populations. It seems like anybody who's having maybe more of a mental health crisis or needing a response that isn't necessarily like police force.
Right. Okay. Sorry about that. Just wanted to clarify for our listeners.
So things that our church has embarked upon, like these education initiatives, just getting connected into our community and to see not only like what's going on that we might miss in our everyday lives, but that really matters to the neighborhood, the land that we're on, the neighborhood that surrounds us, the city that we're located in. Those are some of the initiatives that I've been involved in. So growing food, gardens. We have public gardens available for anybody to come and harvest from that we tend and keep and give away the produce there. We started a backpack program for one of the schools that didn't have a food pantry within it, but needed it, which we heard from one of the teachers there. And so we started that probably about 10 years ago. And that is still going strong at Whitman Elementary in Southeast Portland. We partner with the Metanoia Peace Community, who for a while were serving meals regularly out of a church I don't remember in Southeast Portland, just off Belmont. But now has had to move because that building was sold. And now we are hosting those meals, making sure that houseless folks are getting fed and they're getting access to the supplies that they need to stay healthy and safe as can be while they're out on the streets. So those are just a few of the things that I've been involved in.
Yeah, and I think that really, again, kind of just speaks to the idea of, the ministry really kind of being out among the people and serving the needs of the day and the needs of the people. And, when you look at all this great work that's happening, and so I say this from the, the outside perspective of seeing, if I hear about, churches and popular culture, what's coming up on the screens when people are talking about what's happening in religious spaces, even, you see these pictures of like Creflo Dollar literally like strutting over, piles of money. I remember the clip with him and some other pastor literally just running back and forth like they were, instead of being Jesus walking on water, it's Creflo and some pastor running over money, but it's like, and people do, have a vague idea of like the good work that's happening. But again, it feels like just like in the mainstream narrative, you see these mega churches, you see this, I just call it exploitation of people using religion. And you also see, even things are just like blatant violations, at least from my understanding of how, the mixing or you're supposed to have like a separation of church and state. But in some places you've got people who are, they're very much stumping for like, I know churches as a 501c3 can stump for issues, but it can't stump for candidates. But you got a lot of spaces where they're doing that anyway. And, there's a lot of people who are like, well, we need to rein this in. And the first place they go to is like, well, why don't we attack, the church's tax exempt status, right? And on one hand, I'm like, yeah, I don't think Creflo Dollar should be tax exempt for buying a jet. I don't. I think that's a problem. On the other hand, though, I'm very aware of all the things that church tithings can and are doing in a lot of good places. When we talk about, again, sheltering people, about, drug treatment, domestic violence shelter, help, support, like, it's all under the same umbrella. So it's just like, how do you, as is like someone even within the space, like, how do you navigate that kind of dichotomy and that, just that the dynamic where, on one hand, you're doing all this great work, and you're trying to push it further, but this like you're fighting against the system with so much baggage, or fighting within a system with so much baggage, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing process. I think that there isn't a clear sort of way, or we haven't arrived at sort of, here's a clear path forward for how churches should be accountable with their accounting, right? I think one of the ways that we're looking at that for the UCC in the Central Pacific Conference, in our last 2 annual gatherings, we've had speakers and folks come to talk about land stewardship, particularly from the perspective of Native Americans, whose land we are on, whose land we occupy, whose land our churches were planted on and continue to remain, and just really wrestling with, you know, what is our accountability for this land, this type of stewardship? What should we do? What ought we do with this responsibility? So not just the income pieces and not just the offering or the giving and the service, but really stewardship of our lands. Like what are we to do with those things? And how are we to restore right relatedness? Again, that's another reason I think, you know, for so many people, my age, your age, we're thinking that, you know, there's atrocities that happened in the name of Christianity. Throughout our history, throughout Christian history, and you just can't square them with anything. Like, it doesn't really even, there's no sort of like justification that's good enough for genocide. There's no justification good enough for boarding schools, for the type of horrors that the church perpetrated in the name of Jesus, in the name of kind of spreading itself and spreading the gospel in some really hideous and heinous ways. And so there have been many calls for repudiation. There's been lots of ways that people and denominations, not just individual clergy, but denominations and denominational leaders have repudiated, have issued statements stating you know, their repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, for instance. And it feels really easy to say, see, we did something about it. We said that was bad. And it isn't followed up with any sort of institutional repentance practice whatsoever. It's not followed up with an accountability relationship with the community that was harmed, community that felt the impact of those things the most. And that's one of the things I'm interested in studying here in school. Our institutional repentance practices. What are they? How do we enact them? What's a process? What are some models that we've seen work well? And how do we build on those? I think the church has a lot to answer for in terms of racial justice, racial injustices that are perpetrated, have been, and are currently being perpetrated by folks claiming Christian nationalism, claiming Christian heritage, that at some point they will understand are atrocious. Some of us can see that in the current moment. And how do we stay in relationship with the perpetrators? How do we call them into accountability safely and making sure that further harm isn't done? Those are questions I'm interested in. They're things that keep me up at night. They're things that I'd like to look to places like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, sort of on a more governmental scale, on a more kind of transitional, transformational justice scale. I think could have a lot to say about institutions like the church. I'm speaking very broadly of the church in a way that it really isn't. There isn't one specific church. There are lots of ways that different denominations and their leadership hold responsibility and accountability, and we're not united. And I think that that complicates things. It's not a straightforward answer. It's not a straightforward, well, let's get rid of this particular leader and then think the tide will change, right? It's on all of us to continue to press into these really difficult questions, to continue to excavate these really painful legacies, and to continue to ask good questions when it seems like something is off, but we don't even know how to name it. So there's power in naming, there's power in claiming what it is that actually happened, and then putting forth energy, effort, and some sacrifice to shift that issue toward justice.
Right. And I like that word, like really nailed down on the idea of accountability there, and ask yourself, like, 'cause especially like being in a capitalist system, the default often is like, okay, we're accountable to where the money's coming from. So I know one of the things I've observed with, I've like places of worship as far as, where those, especially where the generational dynamics start kind of like breaking down or tensions start arising, is because you have maybe like the older members are, the biggest donors, the biggest tithes givers. And the default says, okay, well, we got to, kind of bend to their sensibilities. But sometimes those sensibilities are, they're rooted in some like really oppressive stuff. So, then you see this like conflict of interest, you see this tension or, happen there. But I think that's where, again, like this idea of accountability, like if the work is, serving the people and you're accountable, like how do you, because I think we're all still kind of answering, what does it look like to really be accountable to the people? What does it look like to be accountable to these different communities for, specific things and actions and activities? And, I think what's kind of been cool about, doing stuff with the UCC is just how much interfaith stuff they do, like getting off of the idea even of the nuns for a second, of just like, services, I mean, obviously, but like also just like activities and like really providing these opportunities to engage with other people who, theoretically we should have this fundamental, at least in the system we're in, we should have this fundamental split or whatever. But you recognize, oh, no, we can be, even this part, even the very worship part that's supposed to separate us, actually, we can do that together. You not just will you survive, but you might mess around and enjoy yourself. Like, again, I'm an agnostic, but, I can come in, I can come for the music too, I can come for a good word. I'm not immune, So,
yeah.
But you did also kind of like get into where I was, the next kind of question about just talking about kind of like what you're up to as far as at Yale Divinity School, studying this idea of what accountability looks like, but also kind of like what your, it's like sort of like your aspirations in the ministry and what you're working on. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm currently a UCC member and I'm pursuing ordination in the UCC. I'm within the Andover Newton Seminary here at Yale Divinity School, and I would love to do some type of congregational leadership. I think that congregations are some of our most powerful organizing units. And they meet a lot of our personal needs, especially folks who are single or aging. I think it's one of the only places in our society that is this like very intentionally intergenerational space where you can gather and share stories and values and ritual in really meaningful ways that mark the beginning, the middles of life, and the ends of life in really beautiful, profound ways that I have not yet seen replicated in interesting ways anywhere else. And so in addition to those sort of like rituals and sacraments, I think that the church is also a place to search for meaning, to search for connectedness and belonging in ways that just aren't possible in other sort of civic organizations. So yeah, I'm interested in congregational ministry, and I'm also interested in doing this research on institutional repentance practices. Now, I'm currently using the term repentance. I shy away from using the term atonement because I'm not yet comfortable with it, but I think atonement might be more of the word that I've been looking for, or more of the meaning that I've been trying to research and get at. So the more research I do, I might shift my language to that. Atonement is sort of making up for wrongs, you know, correcting past wrongs. It's often used in theology to talk about Jesus and the way that Jesus particularly, I'm sorry, that was loud, okay. It's often used to talk about Jesus and the way that Jesus died for our sins, that Jesus atoned for the sins of humanity. And I am not comfortable with that language. I'm not comfortable with that theology. I think that it can often lead to pretty abusive, horrific things in humans if we believe that we must suffer to be redeemed. And so I'm still learning and still working that out. And I shy away often from using the term atonement because I'm so uncomfortable with that type of theology. And it is perhaps the most accurate word to describe what I'm getting at in terms of behaviors for organizations. So I just hold that in tension right now.
Oh, and, you know, kind of getting back to the idea of the nuns, I think, you know, one of the things I, even with like respond meetings and telling people, you know, back when we're meeting in person, of like, yeah, we meet at the church, and even getting, you know, there's like some level of, again, apprehension of even stepping into the building just when you hear that, or, you know, I guess like kind of like conceptions of, okay, well, if we're doing this, what can we curse? Can we, you know, or how can we show up in this space? And I feel like one of the things that's been kind of like interesting to really see, and, you know, Oregon's actually a pretty good example as far as just like these intersections and collaborations where, you know, maybe you wouldn't expect as much between, you know, the idea of the church and the quote unquote nuns, and that, like, you know, one of the things I was making the rounds, I think it's either last year or the year before, was when it was like one of the leaders of the strippers strike was with a pastor at Clackamas UCC. And, you know, again, that story, you know, obviously is like, it worked in both, you know, a substantive way, but also in a way that was, you know, perfect for our clickbaity time. But, you know, you see that and you're like, wait. Oh yeah, that's right. These things can't, you know, as someone who, I want to say this is the case, but I've, you know, I realize that in what Bible study I do remember, that I don't remember all the things. So it's like, if I remember correctly, wasn't Jesus hanging out with, like, you know, a lot of the, you know, quote unquote, the undesirables, and, you know, these people that, you know, again, today's would be the quote unquote, the nuns and the troublemakers or whatever. So isn't this how this works? Right? Right?
Yeah, it should be.
You know,
Yeah, shout out to Pastor Adam for participating in that strike. We've been hyping up the UCC quite a bit, but there are so many other churches in the Portland metro area that are doing incredible things. St. David of Wales is an Episcopal church that I know is doing some really interesting things around shame and sex, and just recently had an entire Advent event series looking at sex work and kink and polyamory. And those are topics that I don't think your average church would be taking up, but are interesting, and people are interested in what the church has to say and how the church could respond in loving ways, in caring ways, and in ways that offer paths towards justice. And so that's what those spaces turned into in each of those events. So shout out to Reverend Curlin for those.
You know, another thing we had talked about offline is just serving in like psychedelics aftercare. You know, can you just talk a little bit about, like, I'm just interested in, you know, kind of like what that looks like, and, you know, for people who are thinking, wait, acid, mushrooms, and the church? What? You know, yeah, could you just talk a little bit about, you know, what that looks like, what, you know, it sparked your interest in possibly doing that?
Yeah, I guess kind of seeing the way that the bill just recently authorized use, I forgot what the bill was called, but anyways, that at festivals and other places there are sort of aftercare tents and spaces set up for care to be provided by trained mental health professionals to help folks who either are having a really bad trip, or folks who are having trips that like really are meaningful to them, to do some integration work after that trip. And that means exploring and kind of pressing in without re-traumatizing that person, looking for kind of connections or ways that what they experienced could integrate into their kind of everyday life, finding meaning within those experiences, within the things that they witnessed or wanted to be present to. There's a lot of ways that kind of integration work is crucial for folks who are using acid, mushrooms, any of those types of substances, to really kind of connect in with spiritual levels of understanding in the world. And I think that's an area that pastoral care is expanding into very tentatively, but we're getting there. And it's something that I'm interested in learning more about. I have a couple of friends who serve in those capacities already, not clergy folks, but mental health folks. And as a person with a social work background, it's something that's very interesting to me. I think there's a lot of ways outside the church that revelation happens. And I don't know that there are kind of clergy folks and people within the church that are ready to start having those conversations about the revelations that people are experiencing. But I hope that clergy in the future will be well trained, well equipped to destigmatize any sort of use of substances. First of all, to destigmatize it, and then second of all, to really integrate those experiences for people, because I think they can be really profound.
Yeah, and I mean, just being able to, again, speak to people where they're coming from, speak to people where they're at. And there's no way that can't be more helpful, you know?
Yeah, I can envision even, in the future, sort of, the ways that retreats are set up now, right? So opportunities for church retreats that include microdosing, or average dosing even in the future, right? So that's something I'd be very interested in kind of exploring models for, and kind of looking at overall care and wellness as we integrate our experiences with the holy into our everyday lives.
I'm very strongly restraining myself from trying to make some very just bad church name jokes.
It's your show.
It is, but I have to have some shame.
Modicum of decorum, yes.
Bruce, don't do it, Bruce. Don't do it. Okay. Yeah, so, but that is fascinating though. And I think, again, when we just talk about whether it's, destigmatizing drug use, destigmatizing things like sex ed, because I know just in working with students and helping organize stuff like school board forums and whatnot, that's a question that, even though it's not always like a hot button thing in the news all the time, like it comes up all the time. It's just like what's lacking in, not just in like, even just like sexual identity the part of that as well. And just like all the things that are, missing to, educate people to be functional and healthy in the world and love themselves in the world. And I just see, the older I get, the more I feel like I realize just how much I've kind of like taken for granted, coming up in a space like Ainsworth. Like, what, your pastor doesn't just regularly get arrested at, protests for immigration rights? That's not normal, like, wait, this whole idea of like an open and affirming congregation isn't what everyone does? Like, but, you see it again, just how it manifests both in like the community it builds and, how it develops young people. Because again, there's a lot of cases where you see people are getting like these weird things just get like crystallized in you, especially at like a young age. So having, well, I'm not gonna sit here and be like, every child must go through the church, every child must go through a house of worship. No. But it's like, I do also recognize at the same time, oh, even as someone who was not particularly spiritual about it, thank God I was in a space that really cultivated these values. And, thank God it went in that direction. And just like, oh, this is such a great, yeah, again, just serving people's full needs. So with that, I think that's what I have as far as questions. But, is there anything else you'd like to add on the idea of just, the future you see of houses of worship interacting with, the agnostics, the atheists, the rest of the world, and, working together towards justice?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've heard in a few sort of calls with national leaders in the last few days is work that needs to be done combating theologies of disposability, that there are somehow people who are disposable. We see that show up in models of incarceration, that people can be tossed away, thrown away. We see that in the school to prison pipeline. We see that even in the insurrection that happened last week, that there will always be some people that their lives will just need to be sacrificed for our cause. And I think it is we've seen how dangerous that type of theology, that type of thinking is. And I don't know that we recognize to what extent it's pervasive in how we view criminal justice, in how we view even our educational systems, our healthcare models, our housing models, right? So like how we understand eviction and the processes by which people have access to healthcare, have access to housing. Often there's just somebody that's always going to lose out. Like we just take that as an inevitability. And that's based in a theology. It's based in what we believe about God. It's based in what we think about one another based on that belief. And that's such a dangerous place to live. It's such a dangerous belief to hold. And so I guess I would love to sort of call us into radically reimagining that levels of disposability, even if they may seem low, are still unacceptable. That each person, there is no disposable life. There is no one that should be sacrificed for the good of everyone else. How can we move forward for everyone? And that includes people with disabilities, that includes folks who have been traditionally marginalized and pushed out and said that your life is different or weirder, or we just don't understand. And you need to be to the side. You're not going to be centered. How do we ensure the centering of folks who have been marginalized so that disposability can be sort of squashed and counteracted in ways that really elevate the full humanity of each individual?